Welcome to this compilation of the most important modeling and texturing tips for Blender 2.8. It'll be especially helpful if you're moving from 2.7, but even if you're new, you'll learn some new tricks. You can find the full course for free in the link below. Hope you enjoy.
Up until the release of 2.8, Blender has been famous or infamous for having non-standard behavior in the left and right click of the mouse. By default, left click will set the position of your 3D cursor, and right click is select by default. This has always been controversial, and I can speak from experience that this was without a doubt the weirdest thing about Blender when I picked it up for the first time. And the debate about which is superior, left or right click, has raged since the beginning of Blender time. However, with Blender 2.8, a milestone has occurred where left click is now select by default, and right click presents a menu of actionable items. Both of these behaviors are much more standard in software and should be much better for people picking up Blender for the first time. However, if you're a veteran, you'll want to know how to change those back, which you can do in Edit Preferences, and you'll want to click on the Key Map tab, and towards the top you can see Select with Left or Right. Additionally, at the very top you can select the Blender 2.7x global key map to change all of your hotkeys to match 2.79. Personally, I am a left-click selector, and as far as positioning your 3D cursor, that hotkey has updated. It's now Shift right-click. The undo stack works differently between 2.79 and 2.8. Here in 2.79, to demonstrate this, I'm going to duplicate these cubes a couple times in object mode, tab into edit mode on the last one, move a few components around, maybe cut an edge loop or 4, and then bevel, increasing the segments. So when I undo in edit mode, it works exactly how you would expect. But if I go back to the end of the stack and then tab to object mode, I can undo all of those edits in one Control-Z hotkey and then continue undoing. So undo is context specific. However, if we do this same thing in 2.8, note that I tabbed out of edit mode to object mode, but if I Control-Z to undo, you'll see that we go back to edit mode and continue the undo stack globally. And by default, if we go to our edit preferences, in the system tab, you'll see that global undo is checked. So in theory, if you turn this off and then try this one more time from a new file, I would expect to be able to tab to object mode, Control-Z to undo all of those edits just like in 2.79. But as you can see, even with global undo disabled, undo still jumps into edit mode, and I can't undo from the object mode context. So that's a pretty big fundamental difference from 2.79 to 2.8. And on top of that, undo can be pretty buggy in 2.8. We can assume that that will improve over time, but definitely something to be aware of.
In Blender 2.79, you could switch between vertex, edge, and face select mode in the 3D view header with these buttons here. You could also use the hotkey Control-Tab, and that would let you switch between vertex, edge, and face. Now things are a little bit different in 2.8, but actually a little bit faster. So you still have the buttons up here in the 3D view header that lets you switch, of course. And you'll notice that there are a little bit different visual indicators of what mode you're in. Face mode does look a little bit different than edge select mode, which is kind of nice, where the edges are a little bit thicker in edge select mode. But Control-Tab now by default brings up a pie menu for the different types of modes. So object mode, weight paint mode, etc. So we can't use that to switch between edge, vertex, and face, but we can use the number key right above our keyboard. So we can use 1 to go to vertex select mode, 2 to go to edge select mode, and 3 to go to face select mode. And working this way is very, very fast, and I think it's actually much faster than working in 2.79, so I think it's a great addition to 2.8. One hotkey that I used all the time in Blender 2.79 was W to bring up the specials menu. And that had handy things like shading smooth and shading flat, but now instead of the W key, it's now just a right-click context menu. So that's very handy and works with lots of different editors. For example, if you're setting keyframes in the animation timeline here, you can right-click and change the keyframe type, you can change the handle type or interpolation mode. All of this stuff is extremely useful to have just directly in your right-click menu. So that's really nice, but you also need to be aware that the old hotkey for it, W, cycles between tools. So let's say we're using the bevel tool over here, and we're just beveling some faces, and then we hit W out of maybe just reflex or whatever, then it's going to switch right back to your selection tool. So that's really handy and can be a good way to just, get back to your selection. However, sometimes you might do that accidentally, and it can be a little bit annoying if you don't really realize it. So if you hit W and go right back to your box select, that's perfectly fine. However, it will also cycle between those tools. So if you hit W again, it'll go to your paint select. W again, it'll go to your lasso select. Then from there, it'll get to your just regular select tool, and then back to box select as you continue hitting W. So that's useful if you are aware of that and know that's what it does and are doing it on purpose. But I've definitely hit it too many times by accident and just dropped the tool that I've been using and gone into paint select mode when that's not exactly what I intended to do. So W now switches to your selection tool. You can still hit C to paint select or B to box select at any time. Those hotkeys are still there, but all of your specials are now in your right-click context menu. So if you're in edge select mode, it'll bring up the edge menu. Face select mode, it'll bring up your faced context menu, and all sorts of handy things. One last note on that is that the hotkeys for those menus are still there. So even if you're in face select mode, you can still get to the vertex menu by hitting Control V, or edge menu by hitting Control E, or Control F for face from any one of these selection modes. And of course, you can find them up here on the top right. They're a little bit more exposed than they were before. You don't have to go digging for them, which is really, really nice. Background images no longer exist in 2.8. Well, the functionality is still there, but it's all accomplished through empties instead of viewport display properties. So the easiest way to get a background image in is just to click and drag an image right into the 3D view. And that'll pop that right in, and you can adjust it by moving it around, by clicking and dragging on the little X in the middle, or by scaling it up and down with one of these corners. So that's pretty simple and intuitive, but this is behind the scenes still in empty. So if we go to the empty properties here, which looks like an image because it's set to display as an image, you can see that we can display that as a plain axes or arrows just like before, but also as an image. Now, the image empty has a lot more properties now to make it a whole lot more useful. That kind of takes the place of the background images from before. So we can change the size over here, as well as the offset and whatnot. But we can also set the depth. So right now it's set to default, which is just wherever it happens to be in the 3D scene. But if I move this, say, right in the middle of our cube here, then if we set front, it'll always be displayed in front of the cube, no matter what's in front of it or how many objects are in front of it. Or if we set this to back, it will always be behind the cube, no matter where it is in 3D space. So even if it's completely in front, the cube will appear in front of it. So this is generally used for modeling. So you can set your modeling sheets right at the center of the origin, and still it won't get in the way of actually displaying the mesh. You can also set this to not display in perspective view. First, I'll clear the rotation here by just hitting Alt-R, rotating it 90 degrees along the x-axis, so it's more in line with that y-axis there. So if we go to front view and orthographic view, then we can uncheck display perspective, and we'll only see it in that orthographic view. But as soon as we pop over to perspective, it'll disappear. So this is somewhat similar to the 2.79 background images. Of course, you can also set it to only display on the front, and in side view, you won't see it at all just because it's paper thin, but you will see it on the back. And if you don't want that, then you can only display it on the front side rather than the back side, like so. And you can also uncheck display in orthographic if, for whatever reason, you only want it to display in perspective. So lots of different options there. It's not entirely the same as the background images before that were just in the viewport, but I think this is a little bit easier to work with. It's a bit more intuitive, and overall it'll be a good replacement for them. Sculpt mode is going to get a fairly large overhaul later on in the 2.8 series, probably 2.82 or 2.83, whenever the new sculpt branch features get merged in, and that's quite an upgrade. But even in 2.8, there are a few things to note that are new. So first is gravity for brushes. So whatever brush you have, it works best with dynamic topology, but you don't have to have it on. But if you turn on gravity under options in the tool settings, then you can see that it just kind of smears the brush downwards, and you can set a custom orientation from that based on another object. So if you want it to like smear sideways or something, you can do that. If you're on top of the model and the normals are pointing up, then it'll kind of poke a little extra hole in it. And if you're here at the bottom, then even if you're trying to cut in, it'll still push out a little bit. So even here I'm holding control and actually subtracting from the mesh, but because of the gravity, it's pulling it down a little bit. So that's a fun option to play with. If you turn it up really, really high, you'll definitely get some interesting results, but usually you'll probably want to use a little more subtle amount, but that's definitely fun to play with and can give you some natural looking results. Another thing that's cool is the simplify brush over here in the toolbar, and this is essentially just working with any dynamic topology brush with the strength set to 0. So you can see it doesn't just simplify. Let me turn on my wireframe here. So if I zoom in really, really far, you can see it actually adds detail, so it's a little bit misnamed, I guess, because it's adding complexity, but if you zoom out, then it will reduce complexity in that area. So that's really, really cool and definitely a handy feature. So you don't have to just like constantly be setting your strength to 0, brushing and then setting it back up. So that's nice. And also this handy right click menu with the radius and strength and auto smooth options is really, really nice. And depending on what brush you have, you might get a few more options as well based on, what the tool brush options over there are on the right. So those are a couple things that have been added to sculpt mode. Overall, it feels very nice and polished, and even more so, we're looking forward to the new sculpt branch features, which are coming later on. Groups no longer exist in Blender 2.8, and they've been replaced by collections, or more so that they've been upgraded to collections. So you can still find groups in the object properties. Right here, you can see that there's collections, and you can add the selected object to a collection, but you can also do that here in the outliner as well. Now, collections are really nice because you can have them nested inside of other collections, which adds a whole lot more interesting possibilities than was available for us in Blender 2.79. You can also use the hotkeys as before, so if you want to move something to a collection, you just hit M and move to whatever you want to move it to, or you could hit Shift M and link it to a collection so that it's still in the same collection as before, but it also appears in the other one as well. So it could be part of multiple collections at the same time. You can also click and drag in the outliner to drag and drop things. So for example, if we want to put these 2 parking garage instances, which by the way are also collection instances. So if you hit Shift A, you can add a collection instance, and let's add that parking garage here as well. Then you can have a lot of objects and even sub-collections instance all at once, which makes them very fast to interact with and just much easier to use overall. But anyway, let's say we want to take these 2 and put them inside of the blocks collection. We can just click and drag them in the outliner, and they're now just part of that collection. If we want to undo that, we can click and drag them out and put them back in the buildings collection. So that's a really easy way to organize your objects here in the outliner inside of collections. And you'll also find that collections kind of replace the layers a little bit when it comes to working with things in the 3D scene. So they don't replace layers when it comes to compositing and things like that, which we'll talk about in another video, but they do replace the 20 buttons that were on the 3D view header that switch between like what you're looking at. So instead of that, you have collections that you can find in the sidebar. If you hit N and go under View, you can see that we have all of our collections listed here. And even if we're in full screen, I'm doing that by pressing Control and Space, just jumping to full screen. Let's say we only want to look at the car here, then we can just turn off collections for everything else. And there we go. So that kind of replaces the buttons that were in the 3D view header, but that's also not per viewport, similar to 2.79. So you might think that everything here in the sidebar under View is per viewport, but that's not the case. It actually applies globally, as you can see here in the outliner. But besides the upgraded scene organization and collection nesting, for all intents and purposes, they are about the same. So if we're adding like a particle system or something, say like this, and you'd normally want to render it as a collection instance, then you can go ahead and do that under render. Just instead of where it used to say group, it'll just say collection. And then you can choose whatever collection that you want there. So for anything that did use groups before has just been replaced by collections, and the fact that you can now nest them inside of each other makes this a whole lot more flexible of a system. Selecting a collection in the outliner doesn't actually select the objects that make up the collection, it just makes the collection active. So if we select the buildings collection here, you can see that they're not actually selected in the 3D viewport. To do that, I need to right click and click select objects, and that will select everything that's inside of that collection. A similar confusion might happen if you're trying to delete things. So for example, if you click on an object and just hit delete, then you can do that. But if you click on a collection and then hit delete in the outliner, you can see that nothing's actually been deleted. What you've done is deleted the collection, and then all of those other objects have simply been moved to the collection above it in the hierarchy. So if you want to delete everything in a collection all at once, what you need to do is just right click and delete hierarchy instead. Now you can see that they've been completely erased. Let's say in Blender 2.79 you had a file with a couple different groups. In this example, I have a cubes group that just has a bunch of cubes and a spheres group that has a bunch of spheres. Let's go ahead and save that file, and let's try to open it in 2.8 because something a little weird happens to those groups. If we open up 2.8 and go File, Open, let's not load the UI just to mitigate any craziness. And here we go, we have our objects. But you'll notice that we have the groups here in the object properties here. You can see that the spheres are indeed part of the spheres group, but it's not in the outliner. You can still use it in particles and other places that you might use groups, but it doesn't actually show up here in the outliner. Well, at least not in the view layer. And that's the important point here, is because that when groups are imported into 2.8, they're not actually linked to the scene. So they still exist just outside of the scene, which is a little bit odd. So if you want to get them into the outliner here in the view layers, then what we need to do is go to the Blender file view for the outliner, go down under collections, and you'll see that they do still exist. We have our cubes and we have our spheres. But if we click on our cubes here on the collection, we can right click and click link to scene. And that's going to not change anything here, but when we go back to the view layers, again, right click and link to scene, that's going to link this collection to the scene collection so that when we view this, we now have our collection of cubes and spheres. Though unchecking them doesn't really do a whole lot because they need to be inside of the collection 1 here. Everything's sort of duplicated, which is a bit odd. So maybe if we wanted to clean this up farther, we'd want to select all the spheres and just hit M to move to the spheres collection. And that way they'd be only in the spheres collection instead of linked between both the spheres and the collection 1. So select all the boxes, M to move, collections to collection 1 and cubes, and there we go. So now everything should work as normal. So just remember, if you're importing groups from 2.79 to 2.8, you're going to have to relink them to the scene collection. Otherwise, they're out there just kind of floating in a half-existent state.
So what do you do when you've got a grayed out collection over here and the eyeball does nothing? Why can't I see what's in this collection? Well, we just need to make sure that we turn on all our filters. So jump up here to the filters and make sure we turn our video screen on here. You obviously got some other ones. So that's the render one, the holdout, indirect, and selectability. So you can see this one was disabled. So when I enable that, there is our Melvin. So there is a new way to select and deselect everything inside Blender 2.8. So the old way was pressing A and then A again would deselect everything, but now it's A and Alt A to deselect everything. If you want this functionality back the way that it worked in 2.79 and previous, you can change it. Let's just go over to our user preferences, down to the key map here, and this select all toggles. If we enable this, when we press A, it's going to just toggle it on and off for you. So where has remove doubles gone? Well, it hasn't disappeared, it's just called something different. So inside edit mode here, if we bring up the specials menu, there is no remove doubles. It's called, under merge vertices, it's called merge by distance. And then we've got a little menu here. So it's not gone, it's just called merge by distance.
In Blender 2.79, we had one editor for adjusting UVs and images alike. And if I split my window and switch to the UV image editor, this is where we loaded an image file. This is also where we tabbed into edit mode to adjust our UVs. It's also where we painted an image or adjusted masks, all within this single editor. Well, with 2.8, the editor has been split into two. And if I split my viewport in half, I'll switch the first one on the left to the image editor, and then the second one to the UV editor. Now, at first glance, they look identical. The only real difference being that we have this mode select in the image editor, which is just like 2.79, view mode, paint mode, or mask mode. We do not have that ability in the UV editor. But if I tab into edit mode with my treasure chest selected, you'll see that our UVs load up with an image. But in our image editor, if we select that chest color too, we do not have the ability to edit the UVs. And that's the big difference. Everything to do with UV editing now takes place in the UV editor, and anything to do with images is in the image editor. With that in mind, our tool panels are going to be different by hitting the T key in each. Tools specific to editing UVs, tools specific to the mode that you select, which now I'm in view. So if you just wanted to load reference images, but then if we switch to paint mode, we've got texture painting options. But just like other editors in Blender 2.8, we have a hidden tool shelf. So if I right click, go to header, show tool settings, you'll see that these are different and context specific per editor. On the right, UV specific things like pivot selection for your UVs, snapping options, proportional editing, none of which apply to editing an image in the image editor. So once you know what's going on here, it makes sense to split them. But when you first get into 2.8, it's pretty confusing when you're in the UV editor versus the image editor because they looked so similar. So keep that in mind as you make the switch to 2.8. If you do much texture painting in Blender, you know that the project paint settings are pretty important. Controlling things like occlusion, culling, normal, cavity mask, bleed value, and the unified settings of the brush, collected together in this panel of the Options tab in the Tool panel. Well, in 2.8, the Tool panel is much more simplified, and most of the Project Paint settings are found in the Options menu of the Tool shelf, just organized slightly differently. But here's Bleed, Dither, Occlude, Backface Culling, your Cavity Mask, Unified Brush Settings, and the option to export your viewport for painting in an external application. But one thing is missing, and that's the normal option. That has been moved over to the fall off menu, right here, normal fall off. It behaves the same way, but it's just been separated out and placed over here. It took me a while to figure that out, so I hope it helps you.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. Check the link below for the full course of over 50 lessons, all of which are completely free. See you there.